As a professional involved in electricity delivery, the T&D World podcast and tdworld.com is your definitive source for breaking news, industry updates, and more. We've got you covered from transmission to distribution and everything that affects the power grid. And now, on to today's episode.
Hey there, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to our T&D World live podcast. I'm Jeff Postlethwaite, a managing editor for T&D World. And today we are talking about energy, but specifically the supply of energy, which is a huge topic for us at T&D World. We have Sophie Meyer, who's Director of Power Systems at Grid Strategies, which is a power sector consulting firm in Washington, D.C. Welcome to you, Sophie.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Great to be on.
Yeah. Well, this is I can't stress how this is a huge topic for us. I've written a couple stories about it already. I'm probably going to write some more. But your agency, Grid Strategies, is one of the first that was out there saying that the era of flat demand is over. And according to one of your reports that I read, you'd have to go back to the 1950s and 60s and like the heyday of home appliances and air conditioning to see growth like what we're expecting now. So can you tell me about this and what the drivers are, how we moved from having this sort of relatively boring load growth rate to where we are now?
Definitely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. For about 2 decades at this point, power demand has barely budged. We've been seeing under 1% growth a year. And that's largely been due to efficiency gains. We've seen big investments in energy efficiency, as well as outsourcing of manufacturing, offsetting new power demand. So that at this point is expected to change dramatically. According to the analysis that we did of the FERC filings, those are the FERC 714 filings, utilities and other planning entities now forecast 166 gigawatts of new demand by 2030, which, like you said, is the fastest growth we have seen in decades, really since homes were adding appliances and air conditioning. It's also much faster growth than was predicted for this same period in recent years. This updated forecast is more than 6 times higher than forecasts that were published just 3 years ago. So it's both a change in terms of the growth we're expecting and in terms of how the utilities and how the industry is actually thinking about this trajectory. In terms of drivers, the biggest one, which has been in the news a ton, is data centers. And those really make up more than half of this forecast growth. There's also a renaissance in U.S. manufacturing. We're also seeing increased demand from oil and gas and mining. And then electrification of transportation and buildings is also a relevant factor.
Sure, yeah. Well, generally when we're on our website, I tend to assume people know megawatts and gigawatts, but just in case we have some people joining us who need a sense of scale here, what is a gigawatt of electricity and what does it take to make that? Just one.
That's a great question. And I think it is hard to wrap our head around. One of the metrics that we often use is we say that this 166 gigawatts is equivalent to 15 New York cities at its peak demand. So yeah, to give you a sense of that, we're sort of trying to add 15 new New York cities to the country in the next 4 to 5 years.
Yeah,
Does
really,
that help with scale?
Really, it's 4 years at this point because, but I'm just wondering how is this even, we can't break the laws of physics here. So I'm wondering, how this is physically possible, given the amount of time that we know that it takes to build power plants and power lines.
Yeah, it's definitely an enormous challenge and will strain every part of the system, generation, transmission, and supply chains. And quite frankly, there is a risk that we won't be able to serve all of this new load and that it won't be able to come online if we're not able to improve planning and permitting and coordination practices. So there's a couple of main factors that really impact this. 2 key ones are transmission and interconnection. Transmission build out in recent years has been fairly sluggish in the US. It's been picking up a bit. We're seeing large investments planned in areas like Texas, SPP, which serves a lot of the central country, and MISO in the Midwest, among other regions. Even so, utilities would need to be building generation and transmission about 6 times faster than they have been in recent years to actually meet this demand. So that'll be quite the challenge. Interregional transmission is going to be particularly important because connections between regions can provide diversity both in the resource portfolios that we see in those different regions, but also in the demand. And that can be especially important during extreme weather events when the grid is under the most strain. One of the problems with transmission is that it takes a really long time to build out, especially in our current permitting schemes. So there are some steps we can take in the near term, like grid enhancing technologies and high performance conductors that can be deployed on much shorter timelines. Some of them can be deployed in a matter of months. So those can improve utilization of the existing transmission system and really help bring some of that earliest load growth on. Just to dive into interconnection, which is also a huge issue, we really need new generation to actually serve new load. So while transmission, we can think of as the highway system getting the power to where it needs to be, interconnection is how we get that generation online. And right now, it simply isn't coming online fast enough. So we at Grid Strategies love to talk about interconnection reform. We have lots of reports you can go read if you're excited about the details. But a couple of things that are really important are engaging in proactive transmission planning to support new resources. Interconnection processes and transmission are often happening in silos. And it's really important to tie those processes together for maximum efficiency and cost effectiveness. And then also utilization of existing capacity is a huge deal. If we're seeing resources retiring and headroom on the system, then we should be letting developers know and letting them develop and utilize that. And finally, study processes need to be sped up, both through automation and then encouraging the use of the fastest, most cost-effective solutions, like the grid enhancing technologies that I was just talking about.
Yeah, certainly those can be good to have. And we are hearing a lot about, continuing plant retirements, especially from some of the more rural utilities, the co-ops. And so obviously, data centers and AI are the ones that are kind of sucking up a lot of the headlines on this. But they're not all of it. Can you tell me about some of the other half, the sectors of the economy where electricity is becoming even more in demand than it already is?
Definitely. Like you said, data centers are a huge impact. We're looking at data centers as about 55% of the predicted growth, but that still leaves 45% from other factors. A lot of that is from industrial load growth, which is booming, unlike anything we've seen in decades. And we're especially seeing that in Texas, but also across a number of other regions. And that's things like battery, EV, and semiconductor plants that are scaling up. There's also a really big surge in demand for oil and gas electrification, with huge demand in the Permian Basin, in Texas and New Mexico, as well as increased demand in North Dakota and Oklahoma. And then finally, a smaller impact, but still a real one, especially in California, is transportation and building electrification. Those are adding gigawatts of new load. And in CAISO, the California Regional System Operator, we're seeing that roughly 2/3 of the projected growth over the next 5 years is coming from electrification.
Wow, yeah, that I've heard it said that electrification could prove to be on a longer time scale, even bigger than data centers and AI. And thanks for breaking it down regionally as well. But getting back to the data center side of things, I want to talk about uncertainty because in some of my coverage, I've been told there's maybe a little bit of a crisis of trust in predictions like these that predict these huge numbers. There's a lot that can go wrong with these with the data center boom that's supposed to be happening, and the uncertainty only grows as you get further out into the future and try to predict that. So, can you tell me about how surveys like yours try to account for all the things that we don't know?
Uncertainty is huge, and it's not a very exciting finding, but it is one of our main findings of our report. So that headline number of 166 gigawatts of growth by 2030 is based on those FERC Form 714 filings, which planning entities are required to submit every year and provide load forecasts for their territories. But utilities and other entities are being forced to adjust really, really quickly to this new reality of large loads. And that hasn't historically been a very significant part of their load forecasting processes. So they're working really hard to develop accurate forecasts, and the forecasters we've talked to are moving as fast as they can to adjust to this new normal. But there just isn't good historical data that they can rely on, which makes it hard to know what to project into the future. So one of the things we did in our report to try to assess the level of uncertainty is review data from financial and market analysts, folks tracking specific data center projects, as well as shipment forecasts. And based on our analysis of those numbers, we estimate that the aggregate across the country data center load forecast from the utilities is probably overstated by about 25 gigawatts. I do want to be clear that that overstatement shouldn't really be the headline takeaway. Even if we're overstating data centers by 25 gigawatts, we're still looking at 140 gigawatts of load growth over the next 5 years, which blows any kind of recent growth rates out of the water, regardless of whether we do have that overstatement in there. So I think the really key thing to acknowledge is while the exact amount of growth is uncertain, the reality is that demand is surging, and the question is only exactly how much it's surging. So because of that, we definitely need to continue improving forecasts, and there are a lot of efforts on that with utilities collaborating to try to improve their forecasting practices. But we also need to be making strategic, no regrets investments that will be able to support growth and not wait on perfect forecasts to move forward with the kinds of investments that will help maintain reliability and affordability.
Yeah, certainly one way or the other, we got to start building. Yeah. Um, Yeah, so entities like FERC and NERC, like you've said, they make their recommendations all the time, and in our industry we read these and they talk about how we aren't investing the way we should in the power grid, and they've been making these reports since they got started. I think as a result of like big power outage events. Um, and we may never end up investing in the grid what our best experts say that we need to. So I kind of wanted to take a step back and go back to what you said about what if we can't serve this load? What happens if the data center sector blows up and suddenly they do have these large loads? And then maybe what happens on the other side um, if it doesn't explode the way that we think that it may. Just outlier scenarios, I've been wondering a lot about could electricity supply be the thing that sort of slows AI down as this sort of runaway engine in the US economy? So maybe you could talk about that a little.
Yeah, so taking that latter half of the question first, I think that there is a very real scenario in which we simply don't build out the grid fast enough and it does become a bottleneck for deployment of AI. We're already seeing transmission congestion and interconnection delays, preventing new load from connecting and delaying connection of new load. And grid equipment lead times are also contributing to that. So if we aren't able to expand grid capacity to meet these needs, it won't just slow down AI, it'll really slow down economic growth more broadly. And that's why some of these transmission planning and interconnection reforms aren't just nice to have, they're also really critical. I think that the other potential, which is that we are seeing an overestimate and that this is more of a bubble and less of a boom, could also be a reality and could be a real problem for ratepayers and consumers. We're already seeing a crisis in electricity affordability. And if we do a ton to invest in meeting this load and then it doesn't come to fruition, that could be a real problem. So we're seeing efforts across the country to put new tariff requirements in place, requiring that some of these larger customers really pay their way and make longer term financial commitments such that we don't see ratepayers and consumers left holding the bag. And I think that those are also really important ways to protect ratepayers from any kind of negative impacts if these are overestimates.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the consumer side. I'd like to put a pin in that and dig down deeper into that a little bit later. But data centers, they have a unique set of requirements. They operate at an above average load factor, and this could change the way that power supply planning is thought about. according to Grid Strategies report. So could you tell me what that could mean for utilities and grid operators?
Yeah, this finding as grid nerds was one of the most interesting to us. And we checked our work a number of times because we actually thought it might be a mistake when we originally pulled the numbers out. So while the power demand is expected to grow at a 3.7% rate over the next 5 years, energy use is forecast to grow at 5.7% annually. So that means that, if you think about the peak power demand and then there kind of being lower power demand in other hours, we're actually seeing that lower power demand in other hours creeping up to meet the highest peak demand. So this might be an overestimate because I think some utilities are assuming unrealistically high data center load factors. We're often seeing them using at about 80% load factors, and I think some utilities are assuming higher, even up to 100%. But that said, data centers aren't the only drivers of this trend. We're also seeing other types of off-peak energy use. And that can include things like electrification of winter heating, which we're seeing as a big trend in, for instance, the New England, which we're seeing as a huge trend in the New York Independent System Operator. And this does have implications for the types of generation that the grid needs. So new capacity needs, and that's that peak power need, is typically provided by battery storage or peaking gas-fueled generators. Energy, on the other hand, is often provided by solar, wind, or high load factor gas-fueled generators. So gas is being developed really quickly to meet this new demand, and is definitely a main new source of capacity, but gas turbine supply is quite frankly limited. So we can't just keep deploying gas at an infinite rate. Meanwhile, solar, wind, and batteries have lower energy costs and are more quickly deployable than anything else. So I think it's really important to consider these different types of generation for different needs and make sure that the grid is getting both the energy and the power that it needs.
Yeah, it's I'm glad you mentioned the differences in, the different communities that exist. If you put like a several gigawatt, data center at the edge of New York City or DC, that's a different matter than, for example, we had coverage about a Grok center that was put outside of a medium-sized town in Tennessee, and it represented a big percentage of their peak load, something like 30% when they were doing their compute cycles there, and they had to figure out a way to do that. So I was wondering, maybe could you say a little bit more about what a smaller community like that, because that's a much bigger footprint for them. I know your report is looking at it from a 36,000 foot view, but it's different when it moves in next door and you have a really small like service territory and stuff like that.
Yeah, we didn't dig in very deeply in the report into this issue, but having talked to grid planners, this is definitely on a lot of folks' minds. On the one hand, going next to New York City or DC has huge issues around transmission congestion. Actually getting the power there is quite difficult. Whereas if we're looking at a smaller or more rural area, it can actually be a lot easier to get that power there more quickly. But it is a huge impact. We're seeing small utilities who are expecting their power demand to more than double. We're seeing areas where a data center is coming in, and like you said, it is bigger than the demand from the whole town that it's next to. So I don't think I have a good answer yet, and I think that those utility planners are thinking a lot about that. But one of the benefits to those more rural areas is that it is actually easier in some ways to get the power where it needs to be, which is why data centers are starting to look at those areas.
I wouldn't have thought about that, but that's a good point. Yeah, shifting point of view a little bit to the actual tech companies, the hyperscalers who are doing this building. And the idea that they could perhaps hit a wall with power supply. Could we eventually see a scenario where these tech companies themselves start investing more into the power grid if they find that they're having trouble sourcing supply, and do their economics even allow for that? I mean, I'm sure they would rather just keep building data centers, keep buying processors and such. But what do you think about that?
Definitely. I think we're already seeing that in some cases. There's a couple of ways that the tech companies are starting to invest in the grid. First off, we're seeing an increasing trend of larger data centers in particular bringing their own generation. So that's often a gas turbine or a number of gas turbines paired with batteries. And that is for them to either self-supply throughout their operation or just stand as a bridge between their initial deployment and when they can actually get full grid power. We're not seeing as many that are trying to be fully off-grid. I know that's been a conversation, but I think I only know of one large data center that's trying to be fully off-grid. But we are seeing a lot of on-site generation. And that is specifically true, like I said, for the larger data centers. In our report, we looked at 16 gigawatt or larger scale data centers that are coming online in the next, or planned to come online in the next 2 years. And of those, quite a few were bringing their own generation. We're also seeing more direct funding of transmission upgrades. A lot of that is driven by those new tariffs that I mentioned, which are actually requiring that the customers pay upfront so that consumers and other ratepayers aren't left paying for those transmission upgrades. And then some companies are starting to engage in sort of consortiums of tech companies to actually look at how to effectively invest in the grid. I don't know as much about that, but that is something where we're seeing, billions being invested, and it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out in coming years.
Yeah, that could be interesting. It's just a question that I've been wondering, and I've also been wondering about how utilities feel about having data centers as customers. I want to talk more about utility customers in a second here, but are there utilities out? I'm sure there are some utilities out there who are actively seeking data centers as customers, and then there are others who may be thinking, well, you know, do we want to think twice about, maybe offering them something to attract them here? Is there anything that you learned in your research that could shed some light on what utilities are thinking about these data centers as customers?
I think it depends on the utility, and I certainly wouldn't claim to speak for utilities as a whole. I think that one of the most interesting windows into how various regions are thinking about this is those tariffs. I have mentioned tariffs that are intended to sort of protect consumers and force the data centers to pay up front. We're also seeing tariffs that are providing economic incentives to data centers to come to certain regions. So I think there is a real regional distinction. I think that if you're in a utility in Northern Virginia that has seen a ton of data centers for years, that's bread and butter of their business model. So they're certainly intending to serve them, but they're also acknowledging that they're running out of the ability to serve more data centers. And then I think there are regions where, especially regions where they have lost other kinds of economic drivers, and they really would like to see those data centers.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's probably is highly regional. Uh, and let's talk about the actual, just like you and I, just regular rate paying customers. Our bills are going up. How are utilities supposed to answer to their ratepayers who might be wondering, as you say, why am I holding the bag? Why do I have to pay for grid improvements that mostly are just to benefit this, data center that moved in on the edge of town, and I'm not even really sure what that thing does. So I'm wondering what insights do you have on how utilities are trying to sort of pitch things to customers, or how customers themselves are feeling?
It's a huge question that regulators are very actively grappling with. We have, a part of our report where we talk about new large load tariffs. And my joke was that as soon as I drafted that slide, it would be out of date within a couple of days, because there's so much activity and so many ongoing discussions about how to protect consumers and how to make sure that everybody's paying their fair share. So I don't know how consumers are feeling about it generally, except for to say that I think everybody is concerned about their electric bills going up. Nobody wants to see that. So there's a number of ways that that tariffs can protect customers. Those can be from minimum bill provisions. So say a data center comes online and they don't actually use as much power as they said they were going to, they still have to pay a certain percentage of what they originally asked for. Long-term contracts are another one. We don't want to see a data center come online, build a ton of infrastructure out, and then have them go offline in a couple of years, which has been a particular issue for crypto mining operations. So a lot of these tariffs are asking data centers to lock into 10 to 20-year contracts and have to pay if they leave early to make sure that they are covering their costs in the longer term. And then also seeing collateral requirements. So saying that, even if you go out of business, there is some kind of protection for consumers. So I think one of the really important things to think about is making these kind of no regrets investments. There are grid investments that can benefit everyone if they're done in a smart way. And there's transmission lines that can benefit everyone. Grid Strategies just put out a different report last week showing that US consumers paid $12 billion in additional dollars due to transmission congestion. And if we can strategically invest to try to alleviate additional costs like that, that will be good for everyone. There's also times where they're building a transmission line that is only serving one customer, and it's one big data center. And I think we can all agree that in those cases, it should be the data center who's paying for that. So I think it's really a case-by-case thing, but I'm really glad to see this serious discussion about consumer protection that's happening at the regulatory level.
Right. Just to keep talking about regulation for a second, you've talked about the tariffs and maybe some other policies that could be arrived at. I guess what I'm wondering is this is a big, complicated issue. There's lots of stakeholders. There's state PUCs. There's RTOs. There's maybe some federal oversight. PUC. I already said PUCs, and there's property owners, utilities. So I guess I'm wondering how do these people, where does this get hashed out? Where do all these stakeholders come together and decide what's the best thing, what's the best way to proceed with something that's coming in and is changing our load growth profile so much?
I think if I had a good answer to that, I would have a whole nother report to write. It's a big question, and it's been very actively, an under open discussion. So I think we're seeing, for instance, the recent directive from DOE to FERC to take up some of these issues, and that is certainly going to be a really hot topic in coming months, given the very fast timeline. I can say months instead of years. And then we're seeing state bills coming from legislatures. And then we're also seeing, as you said, engagement at the PUC. So I think a lot of it remains to be seen where it's going to be hashed out. There's definitely going to be jurisdictional issues that come into play. So I wish I had a good answer for you on that one, but I am eagerly awaiting an answer as it is hashed out.
Yeah, in the data centers aren't new. We've had them for a while. We've had their demand for electricity for a while, but it is a little bit of a new problem just in terms of scale, right? So like anytime there's a new problem coming up, it's going to take a while for these things to sort of get sorted out. So I guess it's a good thing that we have Grid Strategies and others out there who are taking a deeper look at things. Is there anything else you wanted us to understand before we wrap up here?
I think we've covered most of it. Yeah, I think I fit in all my talking points in these questions. So
Sure,
I really
yeah.
appreciate people paying attention to it. I think it's a huge issue, and
Yeah.
I think folks are getting a little bit tired of hearing about it. But as each year we revise up the estimates, it's definitely worth keeping an eye on.
Well, yeah, 16 New York cities is rather eye-catching. So that's definitely something that made me want to have this conversation. And I thank you so much for coming by and having it. That was Sophie Meyer, who's Director of Power Systems at Grid Strategies, and we thank you so much for coming by and chatting with us about this.
Thanks again for listening to today's podcast, produced by Endeavor Business Media, a division of Endeavor B2B. To hear the latest information for power delivery professionals and industry best practices, subscribe to T&D World Podcast and visit our website, tdworld.com, where you can find insightful articles and sign up for our free daily newsletter.